Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to have finally shared this opportunity with you all and to get an idea of, or give you a glimpse of what A's dramatic style is. And now to get onto the main paper itself. In this paper, I aim to shed new light on the largely neglected theatrical works of George A. Russell, who was, in his lifetime, perceived as one of the leading artists instrumental in the Irish revival movement of early 20th century Ireland. If A is generally remembered as an artist with many interests across different media, in poetry, in painting, as a writer, editor, theosophist, and philosopher, his contribution as a playwright has, however, remained largely unnoticed today. Building notably on the pioneering research of Peter Kutch, I'm currently preparing a critical edition of A's plays which aim to address this imbalance. It will provide the first comprehensive analysis of A's work as a dramatist, which has now come to light. I hope to demonstrate thereby how the term playwright is at the heart of A's artistic identity. Let me begin with an historical overview of A's contribution to the development of early 20th century Irish drama, within the context of the rise of the Irish literary revival promoted so energetically by his long-standing friends W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory. A's close association with these two major figures emerges as particularly influential in his work as a playwright from the first time of his published play, The Countess of the Wheel, which we have just seen just a few moments ago. Conversely, his influence upon their plays, notably those of Gregory, should also be acknowledged, although time prevents me to look at those today. The public perception of A as a playwright must also be considered in light of primary sources, such as letters, memoirs, and press articles. What emerges is an insight into the frequently tense and complex alliances and divisions which characterize A's role in the promotion of a national theatre movement. Next slide. His successful collaboration with the Fay brothers for the first public production of Deirdre contrasts sharply, for example, with his disagreement with Yeats over the performance rights to the play. His subsequent resignation in 1904 from the position of vice president of the Irish National Theatre Society conferred upon him the unique and poignant status of being the only founding member of the Abbey Theatre not to have had any of his plays performed there by that acting company. It is A's resoluteness with regard to playwriting which strikes us. Despite telling Yeats after his resignation he would, I quote, in all probability never write again in the dramatic, previous slide, he would, in all probability, never write again in the dramatic form. Despite telling Yeats that after his resignation that he would resign, he goes on to write two further plays. Next slide, Sarah. Britannia Rules the Waves and The Honourable Enid Majorbanks MP. Set in the context of their time, his plays, all parodies with the exception of one, Deirdre, may be read as a response to a shifting aesthetic and to the socio-political and cultural developments of the day. If we do not know of any plays written by A after the Honourable Enid Majorbanks, his Deirdre, at least, continued to be performed as late as 1914. And I know, like James North mentioned Ella Young there, but we must also remember her sister Elizabeth Young, who was in fact an actress, and she performed in Harcourt Terrace in 1914 in A.E.'s Deirdre. And there was a review of that by the Freeman's Journal that said that one would have suspected that she would have performed in Yeats's Deirdre, but for some reason she was very fascinated in A.E.'s Deirdre, and I think that may have been due to the course that she loved his innovative and distinct approach, especially with the use of mysticism, but I won't go into too much detail on that right now. It is certainly interesting that the public perception of A as a dramatist persists into his later years. This is also reflected by Irish actress Maureen Ashibra in The Splendid Years, which was published in 1955, and it is only in more recent times that his role as a playwright has been overlooked, with an emphasis rather on his poetry, prose, and mystical writings. To synthesize, in the course of my research, I have discovered that there are at least 6 plays which can be attributed to AE. However, owing to time constraints, I'll provide a brief analysis and historical overview of the first 3 plays written between 1899 and 1902. These are, of course, The Countess of the Wheel, Celtic Drama, and Deirdre. I hope thereby to provide an insight into A's early development as a dramatist and to highlight the distinct and innovative aesthetic which informs his playwriting. Turning now to the first 2 plays by A.E., it is important to consider them in the context of dramatic development of the time, notably with regard to the rise of the Irish literary theatre. We might recall that in 1897, the principles for defining a new Irish theatre were established by W.B. Yeats, Lady Gregory, George Moore, and Edward Martyn within the aim of promoting plays by Irish playwrights. Key to an understanding of their aspirations is a manifesto in 1897 set down in a memoir by Gregory entitled Our Irish Theatre. In this document, Yeats, Gregory, and Martyn assert a desire to use theatre to restructure Ireland's identity, not only in terms of theatrical representation of that identity, but in terms of cultural improvement of the audience and the nation who should be exposed to it. She says, and I quote, "We propose to have performed in Dublin in the spring of every year certain Celtic and Irish plays, which, whatever be their degree of excellence, will be written with a high ambition, and so to be built up a Celtic and Irish school of dramatic literature. We will show that Ireland is not the home of buffoonery and of easy sentiment, as it has been represented, but the home of an ancient idealism." The challenges to this aspiration were well summed up by George Bernard Shaw in an address he made in London in 1897 to the Irish Literary Society. He says, and I quote, "And as to saying there are good Irish actors, there are not. And there won't be until the conditions in Ireland are favourable for the production of drama." End of quotation. From the outset, A. Russell, an intimate of Gregory's circle and a close friend of Yeats since their student days of the Metropolitan Art School between 1884 and 1885, lent his enthusiasm to promoting the concept of a Celtic theatre. A frequent visitor at Coole Park in the summer of 1897, he had participated actively in the discussions which led to the drawing up of the manifesto and had formed the view with Yeats and Martyn that the name should be the Irish Literary Theatre, which would more pragmatically become the Celtic Theatre originally, but then they thought the more Irish Literary Theatre going forward. The first play we may attribute, of which you've just all seen today, is The Countess of the Wheel, which was published the 3rd of June 1899 in the Irish Homestead. And the significance of this newspaper was, of course, highlighted in detail yesterday evening in Plunkett House. This play, The Countess of the Wheel, was signed under the pseudonym A Cycle Expert, which A would use on more than one occasion. By this time, he had established himself as a journalist and writer through regular contributions of opinion pieces, essays, poems, stories, and reviews to newspapers such as the Irish Homestead, the Irish Theosophist, the Internationalist, and he had already published 2 books of poetry at this time, Homeward Songs by the Way and The Earth Breath and Other Poems. The play may be seen then as a further testimony to his versatility as a writer. In Cutch's view, the inspiration for the play would seem to be a degree of skepticism on A.'s part with regard to the credibility of the Irish Literary Theatre, founded and launched by Yeats, Martyn, and Gregory in May 1899. On foot of deliberations of 1897, he himself had been involved in. The cause of this skepticism is not entirely clear, but Cutch associates it with what he perceives as disapproval on A's part of Yeats's greater focus on the theatre, believing it detracted from his time to write poetry. He highlights one episode in particular as indicative of A's perhaps growing detachment. After the apparent success of Martyn's The Heatherfield and Yeats's The Countess Kathleen on the opening night of the Irish Literary Theatre, Horace Plunkett had organised a dinner in the Shelbourne Hotel to celebrate the beginning of these new developments in Irish theatre. Plunkett, a friend of A, had invited him to the celebratory dinner, but for reasons which are not clear, A turned down the invitation. It does seem, however, A did attend on his way home and listened to the speeches made about the significance of the achievements made by both Martin and Yeats. In an exchange between Gregory and A, it becomes clear that the Countess of the Wheel was intended as a joke, that is, a parody of Yeats's Countess Kathleen, but may be read as a reflection of his willingness to debunk the Irish literary theatre as a whole. The exchange between A and Gregory is interesting because it indicates a development in his writing as he embarks upon his own theatrical works. A indicates somewhat diplomatically that, I quote, "I pride myself not on the joke, but on the fact that I have for the first time in my life succeeded in writing in blank verse." End of quotation. We'll see that his use of blank verse in plays continues. Moreover, he clearly saw this play as an extension of his poetry, because the preamble to the text refers to it as a great dramatic poem. A's parody, presented in The Countess of the Wheel, has a simple plot constructed around two cyclists pursued by various supernatural creatures from Irish folklore who find momentary respite in a country pub situated near to Ballygoose. While they rest, their bicycles are stolen by the Sidhe, and they, together with a maid, go to inform the local Irish constabulary, who are, however, inebriated, therefore incapable of providing assistance. The cyclists are resigned to solving the crime themselves. If, as Kutch suggests, the parody is, I quote, artless and derogatory, and Russell's sole comment on the first season of the Irish literary theatre, end of quotation, I would argue that it marks a significant evolution in A.'s literary development as a playwright, as highlighted no less by his comments to Gregory mentioned above. Moreover, the play has a subtleness to it which should not be overlooked. A's plays, or dramatic poems in blank verse, will continue to be published in the Irish homestead, but as in the case of the Countess of the Wheel, he would not always sign them with his name. The Cycle Expert would seem to be a pseudonym he favoured on more than one occasion. A play hitherto not attributed to A, but signed The Cycle Expert, and therefore undoubtedly by him, is another parody published on the 27th of July, 1901, just 2 years after The Countess of the Wheel. Entitled Celtic Drama, the target of the parody on this occasion is what A presents as a lack of importance attributed to the Irish language in Irish society, notably by its educational system, with Trinity College presented as particular fault. Unfortunately, to my shame, as it was my alma mater, I must admit. Next slide. The play presents two orators and a chorus who emphasize the importance of the Irish language and its legacy. The parody is set in a round room. Is it the Irish Parliament? We do not know, but I would need to spend more time breaking that down. And it begins with the first orator who recounts how the Irish language is at risk of being lost. The orator goes on to discuss how the Irish language must be preserved and be passed on to the next generation. He gives an account of a little boy who encounters letters in the Irish language and risks losing the language. He says to his father, "What are these letters?" The orator recounts how the boy was put in his care by the father and he taught him the language. "I instructed him in our most holy tongue." We're told the little boy has learnt the Irish language so well that he could wallop Douglas Hyde and give him points now. A's allusion to Douglas Hyde reminds the audience of how this latter was actively promoting the Irish language, particularly through his plays and poetry, which he wrote in Irish. This homage to Hyde and the story of the little boy learning the holy Irish language clearly highlights A's very public support for the indigenous tongue and, by implication, the preservation of an essential and a unique embodiment of Irish national identity. This enthusiasm is reinforced by the role of the chorus to support energetically the orator. They cry out, "Hurroo, hurroo, methinks there is much truth in what he says." After the departure of the first orator, the second orator mounts the platform to declare how, as an educationalist, he shares his colleagues' criticism. The education system does not support the learning of the Irish language, and he questions why school fees should be paid if the next generation is not being taught the national language. He goes so far as to assert that Ireland is at risk of losing its nationality for money, as it prefers to finance an education that does not promote Irish culture and the learning of the Irish language. He says, and I quote, "We all of us have sold the soul of nationality for pounds, and you're as much to blame as we for letting things go on." In his view, the Irish themselves are at fault for having allowed this to happen, and the only solution he envisages is one of violence. He says, "And my advice is to select the largest sticks and bricks and go to all the schools and swear to wreck and ruin, boycott and kill if on the instant the system is not altered." The play ends with the chorus leaving in tumult as if about to revolt against the education system, and the second orator remains alone, reflecting that his position is so controversial that he will have to go into hiding. He takes comfort in the possibility that Trinity will be targeted. He says, "I hope they'll bat at Trinity as well, but still, it's a fair work for one night." This reference to Trinity recalls notably the very public opposition to the Irish language and culture by John Pentland Mahaffey, a prominent academic and future provost. Certainly, A would not be the only playwright to attack the position held by certain of Trinity's academics towards the Irish language. We know this is true because, as I mentioned, with Douglas Hyde, there was also George Moore, and those three were probably the three most artistic figures at the time to really lead their disapproval towards Mahaffey and Trinity doing that. If the play highlights A's support for the promotion of the Irish language and his willingness to take a political position on the matter, it also reflects how, in 1901, he saw his developing craft as a playwright as a mechanism for conveying his nationalistic position in the spirit of the Irish literary revival. Moreover, the fact his second play, like the first, is published in the Irish homestead indicates a willingness to use the medium of newspaper, traditionally conceived as an ephemeral platform rather than a more formal publication, for his early experiments in the dramatic genre. This suggests a wish to share his theatrical work with a wider public than would be reached by a more formal and more expensive form of publication. The fact that the Irish Homestead is a newspaper focused on agriculture and rural affairs with a readership primarily aimed at landowners, farmers, and politicians suggests he saw some merit in his early theatrical works being read by these particular sections of society. Let us then now turn to A's Deirdre and his collaboration with the Fay brothers. Later in that same year that Celtic drama was published, Yeats and Moore had a play performed on the 21st of October 1901 at the Gaiety Theatre as part of the final season of the Irish Literary Theatre. This was Dermot and Grania, which was based on one of the Irish legends of the Fenian saga. The Pursuit of Dermot and Grania. Although this play was first received positively, it gradually provoked widespread criticism in the Irish press and effectively heralded the demise of the Irish Literary Theatre. A was equally dismayed by the portrayal of the Irish legend, and it would seem that in response, he began his own play inspired by the Irish legend of Deirdre, the first of, forgive me Raymond if I get this wrong, the Trí Thruga na Scailta, the three most sorrowful tales of Ireland. I'm sure you can correct me after the end. This is, at least, Yeats's interpretation of A's Deirdre, which he termed, and I quote, a protest against his and Moore's Dermot and Grania on the grounds that the play, I quote, had made mere men out of heroes. If we accept Yeats's view, it may be argued that, again, as with the Countess of the Wheel, A's work as a playwright was a response to his perception of Yeats's literary production and the flaws he identified within it. In my view, however, there is no evidence to confirm that A intended his Deirdre as a protest. The play certainly reflects his commitment to experimenting further with the dramatic form and to bring into to life Irish legends by embedding them in the dramatic form. In this respect, the play reflects a parallel with major themes visible in his various artistic spheres over his lifetime. In essence, Deirdre demonstrates how A, by adapting Irish legends within the theatrical framework, was promoting his own specific view of how Irish mythology could be made culturally relevant and be used as a metaphor for Irish national identity. In this respect, although he and Yeats may at times have been at odds with each other in terms of their approach, they nonetheless shared the same aspiration to promote the aims of the Irish revival. Again, A had recourse to newspaper form to advance publicly and swiftly his playwriting activities. He published the first act of Deirdre in Standish O'Grady's All-Ireland Review in 3 successive parts on the 6th, 13th, and 20th of July 1901. The act bore the title The Flight of Deirdre, a dramatic episode. The second act, The Recall of the Sons of Uisne, followed in 2 parts later that year on the 26th of October and 2nd of November. The third act was prompted by a request towards the end of 1901 by 2 actors, William and Frank Fay, the Fay brothers, who represented a group of amateur actors. They approached AE and asked him to complete his Deirdre and give them permission to perform it. Now, according to Maureen Shubra, an actress who worked with the Fays, Frank Fay believed A's play required a further act, and despite A's provocative and whimsical assertion that he had written the play in part, I quote, because everyone nowadays seems to be writing plays, end of quotation, and had never intended it to be produced or performed. George Moore also gives an interesting account of the genesis of the extended version of Deirdre. He relates how A, recounting to him his inspiration for the play, alluded to the Fays' request for a third act, and this can be found in Hail and Farewell by George Moore. He says, and I quote, "So far have I written," A said, "and as soon as I get another free evening, I will finish the act for the Fays." But he had to wait a long time for his next inspiration, and in great patience the actors and actresses continued to chant their parts through the winter nights until the third act was brought to them. End of quotation. The third act was finally published in the All-Ireland Review in 2 parts on the 8th and 15th of February 1902 under the title Deirdre, Part 3, The Fate of the Sons of Uisne. Certainly, the Fays' collaboration with A in order to, and in Maureen Schubert's words, present a play by an Irish author on an Irish subject with a cast of Irish actors had now finally occurred. That is, to promote an essentially Irish theatre tradition with such a significant effect. Firstly, it seems to confirm the impact of the Irish literary theatre. Secondly, the fact that this new company wanted specifically to perform A's Deirdre would seem to indicate that his credibility as a player for a new type of Irish theatre was by now established. A was, moreover, starting to establish a reputation as a playwright amongst such actresses as Maud Gonne, who had witnessed a private performance of the first 2 published acts of Deirdre in George Coffey's house at 5 Harcourt Terrace, Dublin in January 1902. The play was rehearsed at this address on the 2nd of January, and then it was performed again on the 3rd of January for George Coffey's son's birthday, Dermot. As you can see, a series of photographs here, but at this point, he is actually playing the main character, Nossi, and there's Elizabeth Young as well beside him. And these are the only images that we really have of the performance. There are a few others at Teresa Hall, but it's great to see them experimenting with the play. After A had published the third act of the play in February 1902, he introduced the Fay brothers to Yeats, and as a consequence, it was agreed that they would perform his Kathleen the Houlihan alongside A's Deirdre, not least because this would permit a longer program. The fact that the Fay brothers agreed to this association between A and Yeats, who was emerging as a leading playwright, suggests a perceived parity between the 2 men. Despite the positive attitude of the Fays, however, Yeats himself was hesitant to have his play performed alongside A's Deirdre. It was, however, when Maud Gonne offered to play the main role in Kathleen the Houlihan that Yeats changed his opinion, in public at least. After several weeks of rehearsals, during which A painted scenery, designed costumes, and hosted the cast in his house in Rathgar the day the performance arrived. The Fays Company, which had adopted by now the name W.G. Fays National Dramatic Company, performed the premiere of A's Deirdre, together with Yeats's Kathleen O'Houlihan at St. Teresa Hall, Clarendon Street, Dublin, on the 2nd of April 1902. Further performances took place on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, with A taking the role of the Druid Cotha. The performance was perceived as important on a number of levels. Writing in 1929, for example, Andrew E. Malone believes, and I quote, "This performance marks the real beginning of the Irish National Theatre. For the first time, the plays were written by Irish playwrights, acted by an Irish company, and staged by an Irish producer." End of quotation. The fact that performance is still recognized in 1929 as contributing to the beginning of an authentic Irish theatre, thus providing the people of Ireland with an innovative idea of what form such a national theatre could take, certainly suggests A continued to be recognized as a playwright of some significance, at least in the first quarter of the 20th century. In Cutch's view, A's Deirdre captured what the audience believed was the atmosphere of the legend. Drama critics who attended the performance at St. Teresa's Hall commented particularly upon A's mystical treatment of the legend and the fine quality of the language. For example, the drama critic for the Freeman's Journal wrote the following review on the 5th of April 1902. "It is evident that to A.E., the heroic past of Ireland is no mere storehouse of romantic legends, more or less authentic. For him, that past is a living reality and a source of spiritual inspiration. In Deirdre, to a greater extent, perhaps than in any other drama of the kind by a modern writer, the heroic past of Ireland stands revealed. A has the power of imaginative creation to a very high degree, and his figures move with a dignity and a beauty which accord well with our ideals. This language, too, is throughout of the loftiest beauty, and some of the speeches are perfect little poems in prose." In contrast, Yeats's reaction to Deirdre remained ambivalent and contradictory, as reflected by his recollections in 1934 of the production. He says, and I quote, "A gave his Deirdre a protest against Dermot and Grania because the play had made a mere men out of heroes. It was well constructed. A, in later years, gave plots or incidents that suggested plots to several dramatists, but all its male characters resembled Lord Tennyson's King Arthur. A himself, then, as always, I loved and hated, and when I read or saw his play, I distrusted my judgment, fearing it mere jealousy or some sort of party dislike." As Yeats ponders, this ambivalence was particularly apparent in his correspondence with Gregory and was at odds with the generally positive public reception of A's play. He says, and I quote, "It was admired by everybody, hurt no national susceptibility, but in a few years A himself abandoned it as Moore and I abandoned Dermot and Grania. I wrote to Gregory, who was then in Italy, they took to Deirdre from the first. The hall was crowded and great numbers could not get in. I hated Deirdre. In fact, I did not remain in the theatre because I was so nervous about it. I still hate it, but I suppose Moore is the only person who will share in that opinion. When I saw it in rehearsal, I thought it superficial and sentimental, as I thought it when it first came out in the All Ireland Review." End of quotation. Then, 2 days later, Yeats states, "The plays are over. And strange to say, I like Deirdre." Despite this ambivalence, which is not clarified even in 1934, Yeats provides a detailed analysis which is generally positive of A's distinctive and innovative approach to mise-en-scène in Deirdre. He even indicates that this new approach will inform further playwriting initiatives by A. Of particular note are the following observations. I say, and I quote, "The absence of character is like the absence of individual expression in wall decoration. It, Deirdre, was acted with great simplicity. The actors keep very quiet, often merely posing and speaking. The result was curiously dreamlike and gentle. Russell is planning a play on the children of Turin and will, I imagine, do quite a number of plays. The costumes and sceneries from design of his were beautiful. They were as a thin gauze veil in front. It was really a wonderful sight to see crowds of people standing up at the back of the hall where they could hardly see because there were people in front, yet patient and enthusiastic. If George Moore thought the acting was, as Yeats recounts, and I quote, the silliest he had ever seen, in contrast, Yeats's analysis of the innovative acting style of Deirdre seems to speak to a particular dramatic aesthetic which he admired and viewed as a true theatrical art. I quote, the acting of Deirdre delighted me by its simplicity. It was often a little crude. It showed many signs of inexperience, but it was grave and simple. I heard somebody say, they have got rid of all the nonsense, the accumulated follies of the modern stage. Beautiful art is always simpler and graver and quieter than daily life. And despite many defects, the acting of Deirdre has left to me a memory of simplicity and gravity and quietness. End of quotation. And as you can see here, A drew a few sketches showing that sort of style of that gentleness, that stillness, and that sort of style that was so of the European tropes. And Patrick mentioned this the other day, and I think this is so important to remember, like they were all drawing from aesthetic devices from the European model, but embedding it within Irish folklore to create something new, to create something innovative. And A really enhanced that and showed that model that inspired so many more dramatists who would then follow on that bandwagon. Yeats highlights how, in his view, the Fays Acting Company broke new ground in A's Deirdre through restraint and movement to create an effect reminiscent of a magical tableau vivant, and in this respect became, in his view, an innovative vehicle for the expression of the Irish imagination. He observes, the actors moved about very little. They often did no more than pose in some statuesque way and speak, and there were moments when it seemed as if some painting upon a wall, some rhythmic procession along the walls of a temple had begun to move before me with a dim, magical life. I cannot see any reason in the nature of things why Mr. Fay's company should not do for Ireland what the little theatre at Bergen did for Europe. End of quotation. We see here a preference on Yeats's part for stylized acting as performed in Deirdre, and it was possibly for this reason that he thought the costumes and scenery designed by A.E. should have been yet more stylized. The performance of Deirdre seems to have ignited... Actually, no, I don't think... No, I will. The performance of Deirdre seems to have ignited a discussion between Edward Martyn and Yeats with regard to acting styles appropriate to the foundation of a specifically Irish theatre. Certainly, this style, form of acting, suggests that this performance of Deirdre was influential by developments on the continent, notably through the rise of symbolism in France. Next slide. The work of Belgian playwright Maurice Maeterlinck. He comes to mind, and the specific performance of his symbolist play, Pelléas et Mélisande, under the direction of Aurélien Mareuil-Lunier, on the 17th of May, 1893, which was performed at the Théâtre des Beaux Parisiens in Paris. Whilst the precise and direct influence cannot be confirmed, not only are there similarities in terms of the stylized acting, but both productions used a sheet of gauze to separate the audience from the actors, so reinforcing the lack of realism. Writing to Sean O'Casey on the 6th of June 1928, poet and playwright John Irvine reflects on the use of the gauze with a view to encouraging his theatrical experimentalism. He says, and I quote, I remember A. telling me that Deirdre ought to have been done behind a gauze net. This was not, as you may suppose, for the protection of the company, but for the purpose of making the play appear to be remote. It was remote, all right, gauze net or no gauze net. End of quotation. Whatever the strengths or weaknesses of A's Deirdre, the innovative and experimental nature of its performance led to a recognition that it heralded the beginning of a new chapter in Irish theatre. Yeats himself despite his reservations, makes this clear in a letter to William Frey on the 21st of April, just some 2 weeks after the performance. He says, and I quote, "I want to make people understand the importance of St. Teresa's Hall experiment and to prepare them for the future works. You might join in if you see a chance. I think we must get all the good plays we can from Cousins and Russell and anybody else, but carrying out our theories of the stage as rigorously as possible." End of quotation. As one journalist, Garrick, commented retrospectively in 1907, I quote, "Deirdre, written in a very short time, in the enthusiasm of the time, was like the first sign of a great intellectual awakening that then seemed very near at hand." End of quotation. Writing in 1935, W.G. Fay couches the impact of the performance in hyperbolic terms, reflected perhaps more of his personal investment in the venture and of his commitment to the values of the Irish literary revival than one of historic reality. He says, and I quote, "This production of Deirdre was the beginning of a movement that not only created a native drama in Ireland, but afterwards stimulated both Scotland and Wales to follow our example. It gave to the Gael that which had never before existed in the history of the race, a means of expressing the national consciousness through the medium of the drama." So, sorry, can you skip this? Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through the Children of the Year, but maybe at another stage, if you guys want to speak to me at the end. Yeah, brilliant. To conclude, if it is beyond the scope of this presentation to discuss more fully A's plays, I hope I have demonstrated to some small degree the significance of its involvement in the Irish literary revival, notably with regard to theatre, an aspect of his work hitherto largely neglected. After Teresa Hall, A would go on to become the vice president of the Irish National Theatre Society, after originally being suggested for the position of president by the Fay brothers. By the end of 1902, he would be at the centre of the Irish theatre movement alongside W.B. Yeats as both a leading dramatist and leading figure of the Irish National Theatre Society, later known as the Abbey. Quite apart from an unfinished play, The Children of the Year, which unfortunately I couldn't go into further detail, he would go on to write 3 further plays: The Voice of One, Britannia Rules the Waves, and The Honourable Enid Majora Banks MP, further reflecting his interest in the dramatic form. And also, if we may remember back at the earlier part, I said how in 1904, when he resigned, in his letter to Yeats, he said, "I would in my entirety probably abandon the dramatic form." It shows how he didn't really mean it. He was probably just really livid with how Yeats was approaching the whole situation with the Abbey. And so he did continue writing that form, whether it was through the newspapers or through manuscripts and journals. His play Deirdre, it also must be mentioned, would go on to be revived and performed several times between 1902 and 1914, such as by Clochuri na Éireann, the Theatre of Ireland Company, who were the dissidents of the Abbey in 1907, which was led by Edward Martin and people like Patrick Comey, who was one of the honoured presidents here, who all believed, all forms of Irish experimental plays should be put on, like the ones of the Irish peasant plays as well, and all forms. And so he would allow his play to be revived along with theirs, to be performed and lead that way. So he was still inspiring other Irish dramatists after he left the Abbey, which I think is so huge to show that he never truly lost that acknowledgement as a playwright. Anyway, in the light of the above, I believe what is required is revival of these works. They deserve to be performed, as we saw just earlier, and a publication of his plays, hence the critical edition I have undertaken, so that theatre practitioners, academics, and A enthusiasts may appreciate better the creativity of A.E., the hidden playwright. Thank you. If anyone wants to ask me any questions, you're more than welcome, but I left my client.
Take questions for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a comment, more than a question. It's interesting the point that Shaw made about the actors and the playwrights, and you won't have the great actors without the great playwrights and the great productions. We see something like that on the screen at the moment. The Irish the film industry has undergone remarkable growth over the last 20-30 years. I was just looking back there, since 2010, Irish-produced films. They're not films made in Ireland, but actually with Irish production companies. We've got 31 Academy Award nominations, in other words, nominations for Oscars. So that's one stream. In parallel, we've got wonderful Irish talent on screen, sometimes in Irish-produced films, sometimes Hollywood productions or British productions. You know, we spoke about Oppenheimer yesterday, Cillian Murphy. So the two kind of do interact and interface. So I think Shaw was definitely onto something back then, and you know it's relevant today as it was 100 years ago. In fact, I would love to see, and really tickled by the second last one, Britannia Rules the Waves.
Well, actually, the funny
for anyone from Tunbridge Wells.
the funny thing about that one is, A actually wrote that in reproach to Yeats when he reformed the Abbey, and everyone thought he was being a lot more authoritarian because at that point in 1907, him, Lady Gregory, and Synge revised the selection process for plays to be put on the Abbey. There was a whole debate. There was a revolt in the Abbey when Synge's Playboy of the Western World was put on, and Yeats actually had to call the police to come in to stand guard on all the doors. And there was a revolt, and Yeats tried to diffuse the whole situation by saying, right, let's have an open debate in the Abbey stage, everyone's free in. He asked A.E. to chair the meeting, thinking he'd be very diplomatic in his way. A said, I would come, but apparently he sat at the back of the room. He didn't chair the meeting, but apparently it's still controversial whether he accepted or not. I think Yeats just probably thought he would. And after that, after the debate where it got nowhere, A went off and broke his silence 4 days later by writing in Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin Weekly, Britannia Rules the Waves. And hence, I know I didn't have time to go through that one, but that one's a full, like 3-column play where there's the chief actor, chief poet, and the old lady. And I think we can all get an idea of who those people would be: Lady Gregory, Synge, and Yeats. So the 3 chief people leading the Abbey. So he's definitely using that those parodies again, but he's definitely enjoying to experiment with the dramatic form, so which is interesting. Yeah. Sure.
Felix, thank you so much. That was multifaceted and memorable. When you were performing the short play, I was really struck by what was happening, because it might not have been in the Irish language, but I was learning about fairy lore and that they didn't like technology. So you're documenting and you're preserving and you're sharing, and that's essential, isn't it? I mean, whereas Sir William Wilde and Lady Wilde are collecting it and putting it in books, this is entertaining us, and we're laughing, but it's thoughtful laughter. You're reaching the masses with this in a way you weren't going to.
Absolutely. You know, it's funny you mentioned that, Sean, because when I first started learning the lines, as Sarah will probably testify to this as well, we had to really break down that language, and we said there was so much more meaning to that. Like, we had to really understand what the she was, for example, and understand what exactly were they discussing was the problem there. Like, the problem is the she have come and stolen their bicycles, but at the same time, you're learning as much about the Irish folklore as well as they're in a hilarious predicament in a way. And also it reflects he had a good sense of humor as well, and he loved to experiment with that. And yeah, absolutely. So it's like a 2-in-1. I mean, when I was learning the lines of "Yes, Still Take It All" as I went skirting around by Ballygoose, I'm thinking, wow, you sense the words are fixed in a certain style with the poetic drama. Like, you know, it's a testament to the how at that time he was leading the way with poetry, but he was experimenting with drama, but he was bringing it back to the folklore as well. And so, like, you're getting a whole 360 and you're learning everything at once. So absolutely, hence our myriad-minded man, you know, all directions, yeah. That's it, yeah.
So part of the ride was over, Abbey had been run as a cooperative.
So what happened is with the Abbey in 1904, you want to know, Jim, more about the fallout between A and Yeats? Yeah. So what happened in 1904 is a group of actors. I wasn't able to get through on this, but what happened is in 1904, one of the actors, Dudley Digges, and Elizabeth Young approached A and said, we would like to take your Deirdre on tour to America. And Yeats at this point was very strict about what plays should be put out there. He said we should do it all together under the company because, we want to make sure that it's put on in the most professional manner possible. But here's the thing. This is where the difference between Yeats and A actually comes, because just as A believes that a play, if it's so strong in its essence, no matter where the setting, no matter where the stage, it will always come out in the way it should be. Whereas Yeats believed you strip away the professional presentation, then the significance of the play is futile. It's not there. Whereas A believes whether you put on an open air performance, as we saw at George Coffey's house, like say in a garden, and you put down say a carpet and you perform, and you're being nasty at one point, he's thinking, well, that you see like the concept of morality, the essence of the folklore comes out, so it doesn't matter. And Yeats was worried with A's approach to that because he thought, well, you can't just hand out your plays to people like Douglas Diggis, because what if he doesn't put it to the professional standard that we want it? But A is now saying, yeah, but you want to get the word out there. You want to promote all this work, get the idea of what's being said to everyone. And if you don't do that, then we're just going to be hemmed in and we won't truly have an Irish national theatre movement. So that's where the collision between Yeats and A. So it's like they both had the same aspiration, but their approaches differed in terms of how they wanted to promote Irish theatre. And so hence, A resigned as vice president in 1904, actually 3 months before they actually moved to the Abbey. So that's why there's still a bit of controversy today in terms of how he is the only playwright to have never had his play actually performed in the Abbey Theatre by the Abbey Theatre Company. Funny, so like with the Dissidents of Ireland in 1907, when his play was revived, it was revived and performed in the Abbey, but still not by the Abbey Theatre Company. So it's amazing. It's still shocking how his was the first in 1902 by the Irish National Theatre Society, or W.G. Fay's National Theatre Company. It preceded Yeats' Kathleen the Houlihan, and it really started the domino effect. And yet they won't put his play on, like, say, in the Abbey down the road. You know what I mean? It'd be nothing. It's amazing. But yeah, it's absolutely. I think the Irish film industry, I think Jim Sheridan once made a quote that the film industry was like it was going down the pan at one point. I think he was saying that in terms of the streaming industry and everything. And I think with Ireland, like, they have such a rich cultural history, whether, as Yeats was looking at the historic period in terms of 1798, A was looking at the heroic period and saying that is so rich in itself. You could go off and make plays about that, or today you could make radio documentaries or radio dramas or make films on it. It's there to be seized, but just no one's not seizing it. Or it's the foundation is not there to do it, and everyone's having to rely upon grants. You see, A would have been opposed to the idea of grant applications. He would say, let's work together as a community, hence the United Arts Club. He was one of the founding members, and he said, let's all come together as a community. Let's look at ways in which we can go create stuff together and see this about putting it out there, and wherever it goes, come what may. But he would never be, restricted or felt like he had to be detained by other organizations to go out and try things. And I think that's important. Like, say you don't get an Arts Council application today, people are saying, oh, well, I didn't get it, so I'll just stop. Whereas their attitude back then, like as you saw, Yeats, Gregory, they said, well, let's go set up an Irish theatre movement or a literary theatre company together and then start performing plays. Then 3 years later, they're doing it. And they're doing it in the Gaiety Theatre. And I think people need to tap into the history and their roots, get an idea of how they started, and to think that these are possible to put on today. And even using that technology, I mean, Catherine, I believe absolutely like tapping into film, because film be so, harnessed in Ireland. It's just not fully there, I think, yet, but I think it could be. I mean, I'd love to see a Deirdre film based on A's thing, but that's my own personal idea. Yeah.
I heard your comment about maybe the A would be not up for the grant applications, and I'm running back to thinking about, Juba was just mentioning too about cooperatives and this idea of maybe his approach being different from Yeats because he had that cooperative mindset. And then also thinking of our conversations about threads coming through us about the universe and cooperatives and theater, but also like mystical, the theosophical. You mentioned about the Irish Theosophist and his place there. Could it be that we were talking earlier about lecturing or in the room having meditations and talking? Could there be any echoes of his time in Ely Place and the way that he would have spoken there, and that style coming in.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, hence, as you're saying, like, and like, for example, he used the newspapers. Like, he didn't want to restrain himself. Like, for example, oh, like, I would write the script and we're all going to perform it. And he said, well, I'm still going to get that out there somewhere. So absolutely having that cooperative. And you know, like, he believed in this, like, ecosystem of people working together to create and collaborate and be a community. And I remember Joan and Raymond were talking the other day about the idea of getting rid of the ego and egolessness in order to find that creative entity where we all come together in order to create these ideas and make it possible. Hence the idea of community, like with the Candle of Vision, what Raymond was speaking about the other day. And I think we need to tap into those roots, which AE so looked at. I mean, sorry, absolutely. Like, if we look at the Irish Homestead, the fact he's written 2 plays in the Irish Homestead, and I have to say, it was a pain in the backside to go through all of them. It was worth it in the end to find them. But it shows his versatility and his, you know, his resilience to experiment and not be restricted in one form. So whether it's actually funny, sorry, if we could go to the Children of Lear, just go back if you guys are okay with me going on for a bit. Is that all right, Patrick? Just say 2 minutes? 2 minutes, okay. So for example, I want to say briefly, like, A wanted to, after he wanted to move on to the second of the 3 sorrowful tales, and he wanted to do the Children of Lear. And he mentioned this in a letter to Yeats, and this can be found in Alan Benson's book on A's letters in 1961. And in this, he mentions how A's taken up the Children of Turin, and he wants to try and adapt that into a play. Now, he may have worked on this for a month, but apparently later on, as we find out from Yeats, he abandoned it. He thought it was unperformable on stage. It was just impossible to do it. But A, however, did not quit. And sorry, going back to what you're saying there about versatility, not yet. He was very versatile in the idea, oh, well, if I can't do it as a play, then I will experiment in other forms. So he looked at, as we know, in I think it was 1904 that he published it out. Michael, was it 1904 he published Children of Lear as a poem? I think it was, or I can't remember exactly, but but sorry if you just move on. But he published it as a poem, but I also found out in the Sinn Féin Weekly, he did write as a short story 1 month before Deirdre went on into Teresa Hall, the United Irishman, that he wrote in 2 parts, The Children of Lear, and it's a whole 2-column page as a short story, his version of The Children of Lear. And he wrote that in the March, just 1 month before Deirdre. And then, so it's amazing because Yeats's letter, which confirms that he's now attempting to try it in the dramatic form, comes exactly 1 month after he's done it in the short story. So he's always experimenting. He's always going around, whether it's in the poetry or in the short storytelling. So he's always trying these different mediums and getting the word out there and sharing these ideas with people to create that idea that we're all in this as a cooperative, to make us feel like this is my idea of the Children there. What's yours? Or, you know, I might try it in the poetry section, but Raymond, you might try it in the short storytelling mode. So he was always trying it out and never restricting himself out. So where he may have abandoned it in the dramatic form, he might have felt he achieved it more in the poetry sort of way or in the short story sort of form. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we're done now.